The next part of this chapter deals with the humanistic perspective. And this perspective was mainly a strong reaction to Freud and his view on personality. So where Freud had focused on the unconscious and our desires and urges, the humanistic approach focused on the role of our conscious, our creative potential, and self-actualization. So if you remember from 104, self-actualization is one of those keywords that makes you realize we're talking about the humanistic perspective. Maslow and Rogers are psychologists who are well known for being part of this humanistic perspective, and they focused importantly on the innate tendency of human beings to move towards self-actualization. Now, self-actualization is rather a vague idea. It's called the total realization of one's human potential. You could think of it as being the best person that you can possibly be. People who follow this idea of self-actualization would believe that an individual's creative potential, their potential to do things in the world, is inborn and something that they're constantly striving to do. So it's a motivating force in their lives. And Maslow, who is our driving force behind Maslow's hierarchy of needs, he considered self-actualization to be the ultimate human need. It is what we are all striving for, and it is what we all aim for in our lives. So it would be the highest expression of human nature to achieve self-actualization. This brings us to the bulk of the chapter, or the bulk of this section of the chapter, where we can talk about Carl Rogers and his theory of self, or his self theory. This self theory focused on what Rogers at the beginning called the self, but what has evolved to now be called self-concept. And this is a centralized idea, an organized and consistent set of perceptions and beliefs that we each form about ourselves. Once we've established this concept of who we are, of our self-concept, we have a tendency to maintain it. And this idea, this concept, has a tendency to play a powerful role in guiding our perceptions and even directing our behavior. According to this theory, we should strive for self-consistency, which is consistency among our self-perceptions. So you might think, I am a kind person and I am a nice person, and those are consistent with each other, so there isn't a problem. We also strive for congruence, which is consistency between our self-perceptions and our experience. So if you think you are a nice person and your actions also tell you that you're a nice person, then you have congruence. But we can have issues when your experiences don't match your self-perceptions. So maybe coming into university, you're used to thinking of yourself as a smart person. But maybe you get a bad grade on one of your tests. All of a sudden now there's conflict between your self-perception of yourself as a smart person and your experience where you got a bad grade. So now what do? So our experiences are not matching our self-concept, and we start feeling a sense of threat. So if you are a healthy, well-adapted individual, you might start to modify your self-concept. Okay, maybe I'm a good student or I'm a smart person, I'm just not that great at X topic. Maybe you are like me and it's maybe I'm not that great at physics. So you modify your self-concept to accommodate those new experiences. Some people might go a different route and they might start distorting reality. So instead of realizing that, okay, well, maybe my self-concept isn't completely accurate, they would start distorting the reality. So maybe the instructor just asked cheaty questions. Maybe it wasn't a fair test. I'm a really smart person, but the test was wrong. So that distortion of reality where it's not my fault, it's something else going on. Rogers also believed that all humans were born with this innate need for a positive regard. Basically, that we all have this inborn need for acceptance, sympathy, and love from others. He viewed this positive regard as an essential aspect required for our healthy development. And so, in an ideal case, we would receive unconditional positive regard. So, children would get the idea that they are inherently worthy of love no matter what. So, they got this positive regard independent of their behavior. But sometimes children are raised with more of a feeling of conditional positive regard, where this positive regard, that feeling of acceptance and love, is dependent upon their behavior. So they only get positive regard if they behave a particular way. And this arrangement creates what are called conditions of worth. These are internalized standards of our self-worth, where we decide that we are worth more when we behave in a certain way and see a certain kind of positive regard from others. Now, this positive regard doesn't just apply to how others perceive us. We should also have a positive self-regard. Now, this is a case where we can feel good about ourselves. We can feel good about who we are as a person. But if we have a lack of unconditional positive regard, if we ended up with conditional positive regard from others, we can run into some issues. And again, those conditions of worth that we developed can kind of cause some issues with our own self-regard. So we might not have unconditional positive self-regard. We might start applying those conditions where we only value ourselves when we meet certain standards or when we behave in a certain way. And those conditions that we then set on ourselves can start influencing our behavior. If we were punished as a child for acting out angrily, maybe we deny ourselves any form of acting on anger, even if it would be healthy in a particular situation. So maybe we stop standing up for ourselves because we might be perceived as angry, and then we would be worth less to others. So in order to be a fully functioning person, we should be regarding ourselves positively. We should be comfortable with who we are. We should have a feeling of self-determination, a sense of inner freedom. We accept our experiences as they are, and we don't distort our reality. Now, just like we talked about how this perspective has continued onward, how research has moved forward from these original people establishing ideas in this field, we can talk about how the humanistic approach is currently being researched. And most of what we see in terms of humanistic approaches to personality are going to center around things like self-verification and self-enhancement motives. So Rogers had talked about the idea of people being motivated to preserve their self-concept by way of maintaining self-consistency and congruence. Modern researchers use a lot of the same concepts and ideas, but they would call this need a need of self-verification. And this is a pretty big area of research right now. And there's lots of support for this idea. In one particular study, or one particular type of study, they found that students who are given feedback for how they interact with others, if they have descriptions that are consistent with their view of who they think they are and how they think they are, they're going to recall things that are more consistent with their self-descriptions, and they tend to ignore things that are inconsistent with their self-descriptions. So if somebody thinks of themselves as outgoing and kind, but a researcher plants false feedback saying that they were shy and withdrawn, the participant might actually ignore that feedback and say that, yeah, no, I was definitely very outgoing and kind. So we tend to seek out relationships that help confirm our view of ourselves. So not only do we like to hear feedback that is consistent with our view of ourselves, we like to interact with people who view us in this similar way. So if people think of us the way that we think of ourselves, those relationships tend to last longer. You're going to be with a spouse who views you the way that you view yourself longer than if you have conflicting views of who you are as a person. And this works for friends as well. Modern research also focuses in on the idea of self-enhancement. So Rogers had talked about our need to regard ourselves positively, which lines up with the modern idea of self-enhancement, where we have a tendency to gain and preserve positive self-image. So over time, our sense of self, our view of ourself, tends to become more positive. So when we're teenagers, we don't tend to have a very strong sense of self-esteem. We don't feel positively about ourselves. But as we move into our adult years, that self-esteem, that positive view of ourself gets stronger, and it holds at a pretty positive rate throughout adulthood, though it does tend to decline with age. But this idea of self-esteem and having this positive view of the self contributes to our psychological well-being. If we feel good about ourselves, we tend to feel good overall. And it wouldn't be a complete view of this way of thinking if we didn't evaluate the idea of culture, gender, and the self. So how do cultures and cultural upbringings affect our self-perception? How does gender affect perception? And so we've talked a lot about individualistic versus collectivistic cultures in this course. And we see the same pattern that we would expect to see, where individualistic cultures tend to have a more independent and personal focus on their idea of the self. So this graph here is referring to a study where you ask participants to list 20 things about themselves that start with the statement, I am. And so you could say, I am tall, or I am a student, or I am kind. And you can evaluate those statements about what you are as an individual and decide if it counts as something that is a personal trait, like I am kind, or a social relational trait, like I am an oldest child, or I am a father. And we find that the red bars, so for an American population, an individualistic culture, we see a lot more statements that are personal in nature as opposed to social or relational. And we see the opposite for a Japanese population, which would be the collectivistic culture, where they would focus more on their social relationships with others. So an individualistic culture focuses on the individual and their personal achievement, as you might expect. And a collectivistic culture tends to focus on achievement of group goals, so less about the individual and more about the group, which again makes sense. And in terms of gender, when we start looking at sex differences, and as per usual, most of the research has stuck with a dichotomy of sex, where it's males or females, but more research is being done to look at a broader spectrum. But our gender schemas, the idea of what a typical man or a typical woman should be doing, can start coloring our view of the self. So a lot of males, regardless of culture, and this is sort of male overall, tend to value things like achievement, strength, and self-sufficiency. They tend to be more individualistic traits. whereas females tend to value things like helpfulness, kindness, and self-competencies, things that are a little bit more akin to collectivistic views. And so overall, we can see that males tend to be more individualistic than females, but that's as a group. There are individuals. There can be individual females who are more individualistic. There can be males who are more collectivistic. But as a whole, males tend towards the individualistic end of the spectrum, and females tend towards the collectivistic end of the spectrum. So we can see effect of culture, we can see sex differences, and this can shape our perception of the self. And now to wrap up, we can talk about critically evaluating these humanistic theories. So what do people have to say critically about these types of theories? And you can kind of figure out some of these. A lot of people have an issue with reliance on self-report. How do you evaluate a person's view of their self? Well, you tend to ask them about it. And when we talked about different ways of doing science, self-reports are open to a lot of problems. So people might not be telling the truth. People might not know the truth to tell it to you. And we might end up with sort of biased results because of what they decide to tell you or not tell you. There's also some issues with scientificness of these types of ideas. So how would you have an operational definition of self-actualization tendency? How do you go about measuring someone's ability to self-actualize? How do you know if someone has achieved self-actualization? They're very abstract concepts, and they're pretty hard to pinpoint and define in order to study. There are some positives, though, because these humanistic theories have had a positive contribution to psychotherapy approaches, where at the beginning of a sit down with a therapist, so if you decide you're going to go see a therapist for a couple of months or a couple of years, at the beginning, the psychotherapist can establish what is your view of an ideal person? Who do you want to be? And where do you see yourself presently? So how much discrepancy is there between your perceived self, between who you are right now, and your ideal self, the person that you want to be? And they can sort of tailor your therapy sessions to try and lessen that gap, to get rid of that discrepancy, and get your perceived self closer to the ideal self. And you can reevaluate towards the end of therapy to see if you've lessened that gap and see if your perceived self is closer to your ideal self. So there are ways to make it work. There are, of course, just people who have issues with certain aspects of this view.